Heritage Point wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a meticulously crafted illusion of gracious living. The kind heavily advertised in glossy brochures featuring smiling, generically affluent couples. Mature oak trees, venerable and sprawling, cast dappled shadows across streets, incongruously named after brutal Revolutionary War battles: Constitution Drive, Liberty Lane, Bunker Hill Court. Houses sported tasteful, historically inspired if not entirely accurate colonial architecture, painted in shades rigorously vetted from an approved palette dominated by beige, taupe, and muted off-whites. Life within this enclave was governed by the Heritage Point Homeowners Association rules, a document compiled in a binder so thick and dense it could realistically stop a door, or perhaps a low-caliber bullet. This sacred text dictated everything from the precise Benjamin Moore paint code acceptable for exterior trim #HC 172. Strictly enforced to the maximum permissible decibel level of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings measured, on occasion, by a zealous committee member with a handheld meter. This meticulously curated, almost hermetically sealed environment was the fiercely guarded domain of Cynthia Roth. Cynthia, a woman whose perfectly coiffed blonde helmet of hair seemed engineered to repel humidity and dissent with equal effectiveness, reigned supreme not necessarily as HOA president, but through her iron grip on the Architectural Review Committee ARC. This role was less a voluntary civic duty and more a deeply personal, almost spiritual crusade for aesthetic purity and absolute conformity. Cynthia drove a spotless silver Lexus, its gleaming surface reflecting the neighborhood's enforced perfection, and she possessed a preternatural ability to spot a non-compliant mailbox finial brass preferred, nickel-plated strictly forbidden, or an unapproved variety of azalea from 50 yards, while cruising at precisely the posted 25 mph speed limit. Her interactions with neighbors often began with a tight, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, inevitably followed by a formal violation notice, meticulously documented and delivered via the impersonal finality of certified mail. Once, legend had it, she'd stopped her car mid-block to measure the grout lines on Mrs. Henderson's newly installed walkway pavers, finding one section off by a minuscule 2 millimeters, necessitating a formal reprimand and costly rectification. To Cynthia, rules weren't just guidelines, they were the very sinews holding civilized society together, the bulwark against the encroaching chaos of personal taste and individual expression. She was their unwavering enforcer, the high priestess of beige. Among the long-term residents of Heritage Point, relics from an era before Cynthia's meticulous reign began, were several elderly veterans. Mr. Arthur Peterson, a man whose quiet demeanor belied the fierce courage of a decorated Marine who had endured the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir campaign in Korea, lived on Yorktown Circle. A few streets over, on Saratoga Way, resided Mr. Harold Davies, a former Army Air Corps navigator whose sharp eyes, though now dimmed by age, had once guided B-17 bombers through perilous flak-filled skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. Both men, now stooped with age, navigating their late 80s and early 90s respectively, lived modestly in well-kept but unassuming homes. Their pride wasn't ostentatious, it resided in quiet memories, service medals tucked away in dusty boxes, and in the simple, daily ritual of displaying an American flag near their front doors. The flags weren't enormous or flashy, they were standard size, clean, well-maintained, flown from simple wall-mounted poles with a quiet, ingrained reverence that needed no audience. To Cynthia Roth's meticulously calibrated sensibilities, however, these flags registered as jarring notes of non-conformity. tiny tears in the otherwise seamless fabric of Heritage Point's visual harmony. During one of her regular neighborhood patrols, tablet in hand, documenting overgrown ivy and improperly stored recycling bins, Cynthia's laser-focused gaze snagged on Mr. Peterson's flagpole. She thought, pursing her lips in disapproval. Comparing it mentally to the specifications she knew by heart, she was the ARC chair. After all, the pole appeared to be, yes, definitely, perhaps 6 crucial inches taller than the maximum height stipulated in the sacred HOA handbook. Bylaw 14.7, subsection C, regarding exterior appendages and decorative structures. A clear violation. Furthermore, she noted with mounting irritation, Mr. Davies, likely due to failing memory or simple disregard for precision, occasionally forgot to retrieve his flag precisely at the designated sunset hour. A blatant contravention of Appendix F Guideline 2, which detailed illumination requirements for any overnight flag display requiring a dedicated, upward-facing spotlight. Naturally, these infractions, minor as they might seem to an outside observer, gnawed at Cynthia like termites at structural beams. They were untidy. They disrupted the visual rhythm, the predictable uniformity she worked so tirelessly, thanklessly, to maintain. They represented a crack in the dam, threatening to let loose a flood of individuality. The first salvo in her campaign for flag compliance arrived in the form of elegantly printed, cream-colored violation notices, slipped discreetly but firmly into the veterans' mailboxes between junk mail and Social Security statements. Dear valued resident, they began with deceptive politeness. A recent inspection conducted by the Architectural Review Committee has noted a minor discrepancy concerning the display apparatus and/or protocol for exterior flags at your property. The notices dutifully cited the relevant, obscure bylaw numbers. Cynthia knew them all, and politely requested prompt attention and rectification to avoid the unpleasant necessity of further association action. Mr. Peterson, whose failing eyesight made reading fine print a chore, had his visiting daughter decipher the notice for him. He listened, then let out a short, barking scoff. 6 inches, he repeated incredulously, his voice raspy with age but sharp with indignation. He remembered the biting wind at Chosin, temperatures so low rifle bolts froze solid, men dying from cold as much as bullets. After surviving 30 below zero under damn near constant Chinese fire, this woman, he spat the word, is worried about 6 inches of flagpole. He crumpled the notice and tossed it towards the recycling bin. He would ignore it. Mr. Davies, similarly, received his notice regarding the sunset timing violation. He read it, sighed wearily, and placed it on the pile of mail to be dealt with later. His flag, the symbol under which his friends had flown and died, represented something far more profound, far more sacred, than HOA regulations about illumination schedules. Bureaucratic nonsense. Their perceived lack of immediate, groveling compliance ignited Cynthia's carefully banked sense of righteous order into a low flame. How dare they? The blatant disregard. Didn't they understand the fundamental importance of rules? Didn't they grasp that their individual sentimentality threatened the collective aesthetic, the very property values she protected? She dispatched second notices, these printed on slightly sterner cardstock. The words "final warning" prominently displayed in bold type. The tone was distinctly sharper now, hinting darkly at the imposition of monetary fines. Still, day after day, the flags flew, proud, silent, and, in Cynthia's increasingly incensed eyes, utterly defiant symbols of non-compliance. It was during this simmering, low-grade conflict that Army Colonel James Riley arrived at Heritage Point for a rare weekend respite from his demanding duties at the Pentagon. Riley, a career officer with multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, etched into the lines around his eyes, maintained a residence in the neighborhood, a quiet place to decompress. Though his high-level strategic planning role kept him away more often than not. He wasn't just another resident, he was a decorated senior officer, still very much on active duty, a man who understood command, discipline, and the deeper meaning of the symbols Cynthia Roth seemed determined to regulate into oblivion. He'd heard murmurs from other neighbors about Cynthia's escalating rigidity, her almost obsessive focus on trivial violations. But the flag issue resonated differently, striking a deeper, more personal chord. During a brief courtesy visit to check on Mr. Peterson, he noticed the final warning notice still stuck under the old Marine's door knocker. "She's really giving you a hard time about the flag, Mr. P," Riley asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Respectful," Mr. Peterson sighed, adjusting the well-worn VFW cap perched on his head. "That woman," he sighed again, a world of weariness in the sound, "thinks her little rule book is more important than Old Glory herself. Says my pole's too tall. Doesn't matter. I sunk that pole in the ground myself 50 years ago, when this house was built, long before her precious HOA even existed." He looked out towards the empty bracket where the notice had been, his eyes distant. "Fought under that flag. Saw buddies die for it. Now she says it's 6 inches out of line." Colonel Riley felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a cold anger he instantly suppressed. He believed in order, in regulations, but this felt fundamentally wrong. He decided a direct, reasonable, officer-to-committee chair approach was warranted. Perhaps a calm conversation could resolve this absurdity. He found Cynthia Roth later that afternoon, predictably engaged in scrutinizing the petunias planted in the community median strip near the entrance, apparently checking for non-approved color variations. "Miss Roth," Riley began politely, approaching her calmly. "Excuse me. Colonel James Riley. I live over on Constitution Drive." He offered a brief nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work, but I understand there might be some ongoing concern regarding the flags Mr. Peterson and Mr. Davies are flying." Cynthia turned, her eyes performing a swift, appraising scan, assessing his attire, casual weekend wear, his demeanor, his potential threat level to her authority. She didn't seem particularly impressed or intimidated by the mention of his rank, perhaps not fully grasping its significance outside a military context, or more likely, simply deeming it utterly irrelevant compared to her supreme authority within the confines of Heritage Point. "Colonel," she acknowledged coolly, her tone implying she was indulging him. "Yes, regrettably. Several residents seem to be experiencing difficulty complying with the established community standards regarding flag display protocols. It's all quite clearly outlined in the handbook. Bylaw 14. 7 covers pole height. Appendix F details display times and illumination." She ticked off the points as, "If reciting established scientific fact, I certainly understand rules are important for maintaining neighborhood aesthetics and cohesion," Riley said, consciously keeping his tone measured, reasonable. "But we're talking about highly decorated combat veterans here, Miss Roth men in their 90s. That banner, that symbol, holds profound personal meaning for them, representing sacrifices most of us can only vaguely imagine." He gestured subtly towards the quiet streets. "Surely, a minor variance of a few inches in pole height, or occasionally forgetting to take the flag down precisely at dusk, isn't cause for formal enforcement action and fines. Perhaps some measure of discretion, some common sense, is in order given the circumstances." Cynthia's lips thinned into a bloodless line. The suggestion of discretion seemed to personally offend her. Discretion, she stated flatly, her voice hardening, breeds inconsistency. Colonel, and inconsistency inevitably leads to chaos. Erosion of standards. Sentimentality, however well-intentioned, does not exempt any resident from the rules. The regulations exist to protect all residents' property values and the overall aesthetic integrity of Heritage Point. These gentlemen were warned. Politely, repeatedly, they chose to defy the association. Defy. Riley repeated the words slowly, a dangerous edge creeping into his carefully controlled voice. Respectfully displaying the American flag constitutes defiance in your view, displaying it incorrectly, in blatant violation of established community regulations, which they agreed to abide by when they purchased property here, is defiance. Cynthia snapped back, her patience clearly exhausted by this challenge to her authority. They need to understand that living in Heritage Point means adhering to all the rules, Colonel, not just the ones they happen to find convenient or personally agreeable. They will comply, or there will be consequences. The process is quite clear. She turned her back to him abruptly, returning her attention to the apparently offending petunias, dismissing him as completely as she had dismissed the veteran's service. Colonel Riley stood there for a silent, charged moment, watching her ramrod straight back. A cold, visceral anger rose within him, unfamiliar in its intensity. Her casual arrogance was breathtaking. Her utter lack of perspective, her willful blindness to the context, her profound disrespect for the very symbols of the freedoms that allowed her to preside over her petty fiefdom. It was more than just frustrating. It was deeply, fundamentally galling. He realized with chilling certainty that reasoning with her was pointless. Her obsession with control, her worship of the rulebook, had utterly eclipsed her common sense, her compassion, her basic human decency. This wouldn't end well. The following Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect suburban morning Heritage Point prided itself on. For Cynthia Roth, it was time for the consequences she had promised. Fueled by a potent cocktail of self-righteous indignation and the thrill of enforcing her will, she marched with grim determination towards Yorktown Circle. Arriving at Mr. Peterson's modest home, she ignored the bewildered look on the old Marine's face as he watched her approach from his breakfast nook window. With surprising strength born of righteous fury, she grasped the slightly too tall flagpole mounted near his front door. Her nails scraped faintly against the metal bracket. The pole vibrated slightly as she wrestled it free, flag and all. Without a word, without a backward glance, she carried it away like a trophy. She repeated the process minutes later at Mr. Davies' house on Saratoga Way, confiscating his flag, which had indeed been left out slightly past the official sunrise deadline, according to her precise calculations. She ignored the weak, angry shouts emanating from the elderly navigator, watching helplessly from behind his screen door, his frail body incapable of physical intervention. Word of the brazen flag confiscations spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, transmitted via shocked phone calls, urgent texts, and horrified whispers over backyard fences. Colonel Riley, receiving a call from a concerned neighbor while running errands, heard about it within the hour. He drove straight to Mr. Peterson's house, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He found the old Marine sitting numbly on his porch swing, staring with disbelief at the empty metal bracket bolted to his house, a faint outline marking where the pole had stood for decades. She just took it. Colonel, Mr. Peterson rasped, his voice thick with a mixture of shock and wounded pride, marched right up, ripped it off the wall, said it was HOA property now because I didn't follow her rules. Riley's fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't just an HOA dispute over bylaws anymore. This was theft, trespassing, a deliberate act of humiliation targeting vulnerable elderly men, and a profound act of disrespect towards the nation's flag and those who had sacrificed for it. But what Cynthia Roth did next, blinded by her power and determined to make an unforgettable example, escalated her actions from merely outrageous and potentially criminal to utterly, irredeemably reprehensible. Clutching the two confiscated flags, Mr. Peterson's slightly faded but cherished garrison flag, and Mr. Davies' smaller, everyday porch flag, Cynthia marched purposefully towards a small, grassy cul-de-sac park located centrally in the neighborhood, directly visible from the front windows of both veterans' homes. Several neighbors, drawn by the earlier commotion or simply out for a Saturday morning walk, watched with growing unease and disbelief as Cynthia stopped in the center of the manicured green space. With calculated theatricality, she produced a small red can of lighter fluid from a tote bag and a long fireplace match. "Let this serve as a lesson to all residents," Cynthia announced loudly, her voice shrill, carrying across the quiet cul-de-sac, laced with a misplaced, almost fanatical conviction. Disrespect for Heritage Point's established rules and regulations will not be tolerated. These symbols of non-compliance, she held up the folded flags contemptuously, are being disposed of according to procedure for abandoned, non-compliant items before anyone in the small, stunned crowd could fully process what was happening. Before anyone could react or intervene, Cynthia deliberately, methodically doused the folded flags in the flammable liquid. The sharp, acrid smell of the fluid hung heavy in the morning air. She struck the long match against the box, in the space of a heartbeat, just as the second hand on an imaginary clock ticked past the moment of horrified realization for the onlookers. She touched the flame to the saturated cloth. The flags ignited with a sickening whoosh, erupting in angry orange flames. The acrid smell of burning synthetic fabric filled the air. From their respective windows, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Davies watched, helpless, as the stars and stripes, their stars and stripes, writhed and blackened in the fire. Tears streamed down Mr. Peterson's weathered cheeks. Mr. Davies simply closed his eyes, his face a mask of utter, soul-deep devastation. Colonel Riley, who had just arrived at the cul-de-sac, having followed Cynthia with grim foreboding from Mr. Peterson's house, stood frozen for one single, horrified, crystallizing second, witnessing the deliberate public desecration of American flags, flags stolen from the homes of combat veterans. Men who had bled for those colors, shattered the colonel's carefully maintained military reserve. The cold anger he'd felt earlier ignited into a white-hot, focused fury. This wasn't about HOA bylaws or aesthetic harmony anymore. This transcended petty neighborhood disputes. This was a despicable criminal act, fueled by unchecked arrogance and profound malice, targeting not just the elderly men, but the very symbols he and generations of service members had sworn an oath to defend, if necessary, with their lives. This was intolerable. While neighbors gasped, someone screamed, "No!" and Mrs. Gable across the street fumbled frantically with her smartphone, her hand shaking as she hit record. Colonel Riley acted. His military training kicked in. Assess, plan, execute. His voice, calm but radiating an unmistakable aura of command that cut through the stunned silence like a laser beam, was steady as he dialed 911 on his own cell phone. He locked eyes with a suddenly uncertain-looking Cynthia Roth across the smoking, charred remains of the flags. "This is Colonel James Riley, United States Army," he stated clearly, his voice carrying, deliberately ensuring Cynthia heard every word. I am reporting multiple felonies in progress at Heritage Point, intersection of Constitution Drive and Victory Cul-de-sac. He gave the precise location. I have witnessed theft of private property, specifically 2 American flags belonging to elderly combat veterans, vandalism, and arson. The suspect. He paused, holding Cynthia's gaze. Is Cynthia Roth, an HOA board member residing at, he gave her address from memory. She has just publicly burned the stolen flags in the community common area. Request immediate police response. This is not a drill. He provided his own name, rank, unit affiliation for verification, and direct contact number. He swallowed. The knot of fury tightened his throat, but his voice remained controlled. He ended the call and immediately made another, shorter one. This was to the Staff Judge Advocate's SJA office liaison at his command headquarters. Major Davies, he said curtly, the professional brevity returning. Colonel Riley here. Need to log an incident report involving potential serious crimes committed against veterans off post. Location is Heritage Point Subdivision. Alleged offenses include theft, arson, flag desecration under Title 4 U.S. Code if applicable, possibly elder abuse. Perpetrator is a civilian HOA committee chair. Victims are confirmed elderly combat vets, Marine, Army Air Corps. Civilian police are en route. Ensure JAG is aware for potential victim advocacy support coordination. Need this handled correctly. By the book. Keep me apprised. He wasn't calling for military police intervention in a civilian matter, but ensuring the system understood the gravity, the context, and the protected status of the victims involved. Police cruisers arrived within minutes, sirens slicing through the neighborhood's usual Saturday morning quiet, converging on the cul-de-sac from multiple directions. Officers emerged quickly, their expressions initially routine, then quickly turning grim as they took in the scene, the still smoking, blackened remnants of the flags on the pristine grass, the visibly distraught elderly men who had slowly made their way outside, supported by concerned neighbors, the horrified knot of witnesses, the defiant-looking woman standing near the burn site, trying to compose herself, and the imposing figure of a decorated Army colonel in dress uniform. Riley had been on his way to an official function providing a calm, precise, detailed account of the events. She stole them, Mr. Peterson rasped, his voice thick with emotion, pointing a trembling finger toward Cynthia. Right off our porches, said they weren't allowed. Then she burned them. Right here, my flag. His voice broke. I saw the whole thing, Miss S. Gable added quickly, stepping forward, holding up her smartphone. I recorded it. She announced she was doing it. Said it was a lesson. The investigating police officers listened patiently, their faces growing harder as they absorbed the narrative and the raw emotion. They carefully collected Mrs. Gable's video evidence, examined the burn site, bagged the charred remnants as evidence, and took statements from the distraught veterans and multiple shocked witnesses. Finally, they approached Cynthia Roth. Her defense was immediate, indignant, and utterly detached from the reality of the situation. I was simply enforcing community regulations, she insisted, her voice regaining some of its familiar sharpness. Though a tremor of fear now lurked beneath it, those flags were non-compliant items. They were effectively abandoned property according to Bylaw 22.5 regarding failure to rectify violations after final notice. I was merely disposing of unauthorized, abandoned items in accordance with established procedure, MAAM, the senior patrol officer said, his voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. Setting fire to property that you personally removed without permission from someone else's private residence? isn't disposing of abandoned items. It's arson and theft and vandalism, among other potential charges. Based on the overwhelming physical evidence, the multiple credible eyewitness accounts, the damning video recording, and the unimpeachable testimony of a serving senior military officer, the officers determined they had far more than sufficient probable cause for an immediate arrest. Cynthia Roth, the officer stated formally, stepping forward. "You are under arrest." As the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists, Cynthia erupted. "This is preposterous, an absolute overreaction. I demand you contact the HOA president immediately. I am an officer of the association. I was acting in my official capacity." Her protests sounded increasingly frantic, shrill, and delusional against the backdrop of the smoldering flag remnants and the horrified faces of her neighbors. News crews, alerted by police scanners picking up the highly unusual call details, flag burning, involving veterans and a military colonel, and possibly tipped off by neighbors calling news tip lines, began arriving just in time to capture the ignominious spectacle of Cynthia Roth, the queen of Heritage Point's aesthetic purity, being searched, handcuffed, and firmly guided, still protesting loudly, into the back of a marked police car. Colonel Riley stood stoically nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but radiating a quiet, profound satisfaction. He watched the patrol car pull away, a silent witness to the swift, inevitable consequences she had so arrogantly brought upon herself. The story didn't just go viral, it detonated across the internet and news channels almost instantaneously. Mrs. Gable's shaky smartphone video, capturing Cynthia's pronouncements and the horrific act of burning the flags, was everywhere within hours. Flag-burning HOA Karen arrested after torching veterans' stolen flags became the #1 trending hashtag across multiple social media platforms. Memes juxtaposing Cynthia's smug official HOA portrait with images of her enraged, handcuffed face, and the charred flag remnants flooded the internet. Veterans organizations from the VFW to the American Legion issued furious condemnations, demanding the harshest possible prosecution. Politicians of all stripes scrambled to issue statements expressing their profound outrage and unwavering support for veterans. Cynthia Roth became, literally overnight, one of America's most despised and ridiculed figures, the ultimate embodiment of petty tyranny, disrespecting cherished national symbols and the sacrifices of those who served them. Heritage Point HOA imploded. The board, utterly unprepared for the firestorm of negative publicity, the deluge of hateful emails and phone calls, the threats of lawsuits from residents, and the sudden, intense scrutiny from national media, descended into panicked chaos. They faced internal rebellion from homeowners, horrified by Cynthia's actions, and the national disgrace she had brought upon their gracious living community. An emergency board meeting was convened. Cynthia Roth was immediately, unanimously, and permanently removed from the board and stripped of all committee assignments and HOA privileges. They issued multiple, increasingly abject public apologies via press releases and their community website. But the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Facing potential lawsuits and immense pressure, the HOA was forced not only to arrange for the immediate replacement of the veterans' flags, but also to undertake a complete, top-to-bottom review and rewriting of their bylaws regarding flag displays, effectively eliminating the petty, ambiguous restrictions Cynthia had so zealously and destructively weaponized. Cynthia Roth faced a formidable barrage of criminal charges: felony theft due to the value and nature of the items, felony arson, felony vandalism, possibly trespassing, and potentially additional charges related to elder abuse or even hate crimes, depending on the specifics of state law and the district attorney's final interpretation of her motives and the impact on the vulnerable victims. Given the extremely high-profile nature of the case, the status of the victims, the overwhelming evidence, and the intense public pressure demanding accountability, the district attorney pursued the maximum available charges, refusing any suggestion of leniency or plea bargains. Her attempts to portray herself as a misunderstood victim, merely enforcing rules for the good of the community, were met with universal scorn by the public and curt dismissal by the court. Her conviction, like her arrest, was swift. The trial itself was almost a formality, the video evidence and eyewitness testimonies painting an undeniable picture. At sentencing, the judge delivered a blistering excoriation of her conduct, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. He spoke directly to Cynthia, who seethen-faced, diminished, her blonde helmet now looking like a cheap wig. You wrapped your petty, obsessive desire for control in the guise of enforcing community rules, the judge declared, his words echoing in the packed courtroom where Mr. Peterson and Mr. Davies sat listening intently, surrounded by supportive neighbors and fellow veterans. And you used that perceived authority to attack not just elderly men, but the very symbols of sacrifice, freedom, and national unity they dedicated their lives to defending. Your actions were not just illegal, they were profoundly offensive, deeply wounding, and caused immeasurable pain and national outrage. The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This court must send an unequivocal message. Such behavior will not be tolerated. Cynthia Roth received a significant state prison sentence, ensuring she would spend several years contemplating the consequences of her rules from behind bars. The court also ordered hefty financial restitution to Mr. Peterson and Mr. Davies for the emotional distress caused, and civil lawsuits, filed almost immediately after the criminal conviction, quickly followed, targeting her remaining assets, including her once pristine house in Heritage Point. Weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, a small solemn ceremony was held in the Heritage Point cul-de-sac, the grass now repaired, the air clear. Colonel James Riley, back for another weekend, stood proudly alongside Mr. Peterson and Mr. Davies, both men looking frail but resolute, members of the local VFW post, in full uniform, conducted a formal flag-raising ceremony, presenting the two veterans with brand-new, properly consecrated American flags. As the flags were carefully raised on newly installed, perfectly compliant flagpoles donated by a local hardware store, a sense of quiet restoration settled over the small gathering. Neighbors watched respectfully, some with tears in their eyes. The community, humble, scarred, and significantly poorer, had learned a harsh, painful lesson. True heritage, true gracious living, wasn't found in rigidly enforced aesthetic codes or the thickness of a rule book. It resided in mutual respect, in common decency, and in honoring the profound sacrifices symbolized by the flag those veterans cherished. The veterans admitted later, quietly, that seeing the new flags initially brought a pang, a reminder of the violation, a kind of moral injury that wouldn't easily heal. But watching them snap smartly in the autumn breeze, surrounded by supportive neighbors, and the quiet dignity of the VFW Honor Guard, began the slow process of reclaiming not just their symbols, but their peace. Cynthia Roth's reign of petty tyranny had ended in flames and disgrace, replaced by a hard-won, fragile understanding that some symbols, and the quiet heroes who honor them, stand inviolably above any homeowner association bylaw,